everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Lindsay Harris, and I'm honored to serve as the Associate Dean for Clinical and Experiential Programs at UDC Law, the University of the District of Columbia. And we are here today for our Conversations with Clinicians series. This is a series where UDC Law clinicians engage in conversations with leaders in the experiential education field. UDC was really an early leader in clinical education, and we are a school where all of our students take between 10 to 14 mandatory clinic credits as a graduation requirement. And so we're very keen on creating a space where clinicians across the country and maybe the world can engage in topics of interest, along with engaging some of the most pressing issues in our community. So I direct our Immigration and Human Rights Clinic. Today, I'm thrilled to be in conversation with Stanford Law School's Professor Ron Tyler, who directs their Criminal Defense Clinic. I'll tell you a little bit more about him, but I first just wanted to recognize that for today, we have a really diverse audience. Many of you are teaching, are law professors or clinicians. Some of you are law students. Many of you are in practice and supervising other attorneys or law students, or maybe confronting some of the issues we're going to talk about today yourself too. So today we're really going to be focused on talking about attorney and law student burnout, secondary trauma, and self-care. So let me tell you a little bit about our esteemed guest. Professor Tyler is the director of the Criminal Defense Clinic at Stanford Law School. And the clinic, which I'll tell you a little bit more about, represents clients in the Superior Courts of California. His scholarly agenda focuses on self-care skills for lawyers, along with criminal practice and procedure. Before he joined the faculty at Stanford, Professor Tyler was an assistant federal public defender for 22 years in the Northern District of California. A dedicated defense attorney and nationally recognized expert, he has litigated at trial and appellate courts covering the full gamut of federal criminal cases. He teaches regularly at seminars for criminal defense attorneys, investigators, and paralegals. Indeed, this past summer, he taught an 8-week-long self-care course for public defenders that I am excited to hear more about today. Professor Tyler is also active in several nonprofits, including the executive committee of the ACLU and on the board of regents of the National Criminal Defense College. He also serves on the executive committee of the board of directors of the GRIP Training Institute. This is a vital nonprofit providing mindfulness-based emotional intelligence training to men serving lengthy terms in California prisons. So there's a lot more we could say, but without further ado, let's talk to Professor Tyler himself. And we usually start these sessions with Professor Tyler, if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit or a lot about your path to where you are today in clinical teaching as a professor at Stanford. How did you get there?
Well, first of all, Professor Harris, may I call you Lindsay?
Please, yes.
So first of all, thank you. It really is an honor and a privilege to be able to talk with you and with our audience today. Thank you, everyone who is tuning in. This work is so important to me, and I consider myself so lucky to be able to spend my life energy doing this work. So thank you for this opportunity.
We're so honored to have you.
So your first question is, remind me of your first question.
The question is really just a little bit about your path to clinical teaching. Sometimes folks who are tuning in are aspiring professors. And so learning a little bit about how you ended up where you are and whether that was intentional or not would be fantastic.
Yeah, thank you. I was having this conversation actually with a group of students recently, and the biggest takeaway from that conversation was to encourage folks to not be concerned if they do not have a clear idea about where they want to be, where they want to end up. I said, oftentimes, someone who is at this point in their career, where I am, it may look to the outside world as though this was all a plan. There was a master plan here, and I executed it perfectly. And that's not accurate. I actually was initially in high tech. I have a computer science degree from MIT, and that's how I first ended up in California. And then I moved from high tech into law because I knew that I needed something that was going to combine head and heart. And I went to law school specifically to do public interest work. And like some others, by the time I left law school, I was like, well, pro bono counts the same as billables. So, I can make this work. And then fortunately, that did not happen. I was in a clerkship, and in my clerkship, I met the head of the Federal Defender's Office for the Northern District of California, the late, great Barry Portman. And he immediately convinced me that I should begin the work that I really cared about and begin it immediately. And I did. And that's how I ended up for those 22 years as an assistant federal public defender. During that time, I also taught. I began as an adjunct professor at Hastings, which will soon be renamed. I'm happy to say Hastings College of the Law. Happy to say renamed because I think it's important that we elevate, that we are careful to not continue to elevate the names and histories of folks who have negative impact on Indigenous folks and others. In any event, I was an adjunct professor teaching at Hastings, and that was important. I had actually been teaching in high tech as well prior to that time. So I knew that I enjoyed teaching. And I knew that I was learning, that teaching was about learning, that I was learning at the same time my students were learning. It's not just about standing and delivering. That's the wrong idea. And so I became increasingly interested in how I might be able to combine my ongoing desire to serve underserved communities, to serve marginalized communities, to continue to do public defense work and yet teach at the same time. And I was very fortunate to be able to have the opportunity to pursue the position at Stanford and ultimately to achieve it 10 years ago. So.
Wow, thank you for so much of that really resonates with me. I actually was also an adjunct teaching before I went on the market, and I think that is, you get advice sometimes not to adjunct teach because then you might make yourself seem somehow less scholarly or appealing for a kind of tenure track position, I think, or a doctrinal position. But I think on the flip side of the coin, it can be so helpful to demonstrate that you actually have teaching experience and interest. So thank you for sharing all of that, and especially also that you didn't have things all planned out when you were graduating from law school, right? And you kind of had a pivot even in your first job that you had after graduation, and that's something that I think we all share with students really frequently. So can you tell us a bit more then about your current role at Stanford and the clinic you're working in now and what your clinic does? Because I think that's really helpful context for some of the insight that you'll be sharing today.
Sure. So the clinic, and I noticed that among other things that need to be updated, my clinic description also needs to be updated. When I first came to Stanford, it was important to me, and it is still important to me, to make sure that my students are front-facing, that they have the opportunity to be fully engaged with their clients. And so in spite of my over 2 decades of experience in the federal system, I was reluctant to begin a federal clinic because my concern was that the stakes were much too high, and that the deal that we always make with our clients is that they're going to be better off because of their engagement with us. And I didn't feel that that was a deal that I could make good on in federal work. And so that is why my clinic at the outset and for much of its time has been a clinic that focuses in the state courts of California, which is really important work, without a doubt. I have one of the bonuses of the pandemic actually is that we have now actually evolved so that we have a federal practice as well, by identifying bite-sized issues that can be addressed by clinical students. And so in our federal practice, we represent folks who are on supervised release or probation, who are able to demonstrate with our assistance that they no longer need to be on supervised release or probation. And so those motions for early termination are perfect vehicles for high quality writing and for oral advocacy before federal judges. So that's one component. And then the other component is our traditional federal, our traditional state work, where we represent folks who find themselves entangled in the criminal legal system in the counties that surround Stanford. That's such great work because it immediately provides students with an understanding that they're not living in a bubble. They are part of a broader community, and that broader community includes many people who are over-policed and who live in over-policed communities and are impacted by police interactions on a daily basis. So those cases we get from relationships that we have with, so the federal cases are based on our relationship with the federal defender of the Northern District of California. And I think Jody Linker, who is the federal defender for the district. Our state cases come from the Santa Clara County Public Defender's Office and from the San Mateo County Private Defender Program. So then we have these three different venues that we practice in, three different examples then, three different jurisdictions. So that's fascinating for the students as well, to see the difference between federal and state, to see the difference between a public defender office and a private defender panel-based system, to see just differences between the history of these different areas. And so in the state practice, we're identifying cases that we believe have live Fourth Amendment issues. The benefit in California is if you identify those cases, you file your suppression motions, you get a hearing. And so that means that our students have this raw material that they can use in order to develop their all of their trial skills, other than jury selection. We're not doing trials, so there's no jury selection, but every other aspect is available in these cases. So that's at least the case selection and case component aspects of the clinic. There's lots more I could talk about, but that's sort of an outline anyway. Wow. But that's sorry, the last thing I'll say is that the goal is, I mean, we're on a quarter system at Stanford. And so the goal is to, in that very short order, the fall quarter is 12 weeks, the winter quarter 11, the spring quarter 10. And so in very short order to move from meeting our clients to resolution of their case. And when we're selecting these state cases, that means we're thinking of these as case dispositive motions. And ideally, you know, by the end of the quarter, we're in the evidentiary hearing. We win the motion, the case goes away. It's case dispositive. If we don't win, then either we resolve the case, or because of the relationship that we have with those offices, we reconnect our clients with an attorney who will take their case forward as necessary.
Wow. Well, so it sounds like you're very focused on your students directly engaging with clients and being exposed to these systems, right? Systems that we know are unjust, oppressive, biased systems in so many ways, and that they're also having this very intense experience within a short period of time in your clinic. So I wanted to talk to you about the article that you wrote, and it's called First Thing We Do, Let's Heal All the Law Students, Incorporating Self-Care into a Criminal Defense Clinic. And so I'm putting that in the chat so people have the link to look at it later. But we get to hear from the actual author here. I'm wondering if there was a moment that led you to this, or a series of moments, or how did you first become so focused on this issue around law student wellness?
Thank you. And before I answer that, I also need to thank Molly O'Neill, who is the public defender for Santa Clara County, and Lisa McGuire, who is the chief private defender for San Mateo County, who are the other two offices that I mentioned. So in terms of how I arrived at the point of writing this article, well, first of all, as all academics in this audience will know, publish or perish. So I knew that when I came to Stanford, I would need to be publishing. And it reminded me of an earlier time in my career where I first had the opportunity to teach a workshop for lawyers on anything I wanted. There were earlier times where someone would say, would you please teach a workshop on cross-examination? Would you teach a workshop on direct examination, or whatever it was? So it's something that was a particular area that they needed work done in. And then there was a moment in time where someone said, we just want you to come and teach. We appreciate what you've done in the past. We've seen you in other settings, and we'd like you to come and teach. Well, about what? And they said, anything. And I thought, well, then if that's the case, what matters most to me? And what mattered most to me at that moment, and still matters a great deal to me, was client-centered representation. And so as I arrived at Stanford, and I thought, well, now, yes, there is absolutely this obligation to research and publish, but I don't want it to be on something that is dry, that doesn't really have a deep meaning to me. And so what will that be? And that's how I arrived at this recognition that as I left my practice after those over 2 decades, and came to really continue my practice, but continue it, in essence, running a little public defender clinic. That's really what I'm doing. I thought, I'm really fortunate because I've arrived at this point and I'm whole. I am healthy. I'm well. I have an intact long-term relationship, intact marriage. I don't have a substance abuse issues. All these different things that unfortunately I could see throughout the profession, locally, regionally, nationally, that were impacting my brothers and sisters. And I thought, what are the lessons that I've learned? What are more lessons that I can learn in order to help to shift the culture in a way that could lead to more people being healthy and continuing as public defenders, continuing in indigent defense. That's what led me to consider publishing. But there's a big step between that and publishing an article that's about integrating self-care into a law school clinic. So what I had decided was, I'm going to use my clinic as a laboratory. I'm going to develop a curriculum, a self-care curriculum that I can then begin to deliver around the country in order to help be part of the effort to change the culture in public defender offices. So it's not a sink or swim. It's not a, either you've got it or you don't. It's that instead it really focuses on and recognizes the damage and harm, the challenges, the emotional challenges that we face, and it's grounded in science and has a focused way of addressing it. That was the idea. It's like, I'll use the clinic as a lab, I'll create this curriculum, and then I'll teach it elsewhere. That's how it started, and then things evolved from there.
So just a couple of things you said just hit me so much. When you started out with, I'm whole, I'm healthy, I'm well, right? Just those words, and that being our aspiration and our commitment, and what we are actually trying to do here in terms of this culture shift, as you called it, right? Normalizing conversations around these issues. And that's exactly what we're trying to do, and what some of my own work attempts to do as well. So can you tell us a little bit then about the curriculum that you developed? Like, what are you actually doing? How are you practicing differently with your students with this lens in your clinic to take these kind of ideas on self-care, on wellness, and put them into practice?
Sure. So as the article indicates, when I first created a curriculum, it was a one-shot deal. It was like, okay, I have lots of different workshops that I'm teaching over the course of the term, and I'm going to add a self-care workshop. And I did, and I thought it was fine. But it became evident pretty quickly that it was insufficient, that it was a start, but that really it would be much better to have a series of workshops, because I was actually interested in not just providing some type of introduction, but helping to impact longer term change. And also, I began to recognize that, it's not really that this is just a laboratory for curriculum that I will provide to public defenders. It turns out my students actually really need this. It turns out that both because of the impacts of law school itself, as well as the impacts, even though it's only a 12-week experience or less, there were and are very real emotional impacts on my students. And so I realized I actually owe them more than just a single workshop on self-care. And given that, I began researching, because I thought, first thing is, it's not as though no one's ever thought about the importance of self-care. Secondly, we are in a helping profession, even though some folks would prefer to think that we're just in a profession that's a very lofty, Holmesian sort of pursuit. We're in a helping profession. And so I thought I would like to look at adjacent helping professions to see how they have responded to issues of self-care. And so I began my research there, looking at social work, looking at nursing, looking at medicine in general. And it was quickly evident that, well, yes, there have been these significant efforts around recognizing the impact that medicine, for example, has on doctors. And what I was especially excited about were some of these studies of emergency room doctors. I think it's a great analogy to public defense. It's something that I, in fact, had frequently said to friends in earlier years. I was like, we're like emergency room doctors. We have no idea who's coming, and suddenly there they are. I would think about a duty day where I would show up and it's like, who's coming? It's like the ambulance coming from the highway. It's like, who's been caught up in the net that I need to help to somehow extricate from this net. And so when I discovered that there were a number of different programs, self-care programs around focusing on emergency room doctors, I thought that was really interesting. So I studied some of those programs. I studied more widely on law student well-being, and gradually built out this 8-week curriculum, which varies now, I will say, by the way. The 8-week curriculum in new form exists from what I created for the summer, which we'll talk about a little later, I imagine. But with the law students now, it's about a 6-week curriculum, and that's changed over time as well. Where it begins is with the foundations of self-care. And that's an innovation, by the way, really from the summer, because what I have done traditionally is begun with, in essence, sort of an overview about some of the ideas around self-care. And then from some of the student feedback, I realized I actually need to step back. And let's start with, for all of us, what are the foundations of self-care? Healthy eating, healthy sleep, healthy exercise. And for every session, it is founded in evidence. It's founded in science. So without that, it can sometimes just sound like, well, of course, that's just common sense. Well, what makes it, I want folks to be skeptical of common sense. First of all, common according to whom, sense according to whom. So I want to tie it to evidence. I want people to then look at that evidence, look at the, and they can sort of come to some of their own conclusions. So I use studies of sleep scientists, exercise experts, and I tie all of those things to this initial session on the foundations of care. And in that initial session, though, as in every session, I include meditation. The emergency room studies that I talked about were themselves based on John Kabat-Zinn's mindfulness-based stress reduction curriculum. I've taken that course myself as well. And every session, all of my sessions are in a certain way, at least inspired by that structure. And so we begin with the first time we do it, we probably just call it relaxation, because I really want it to be accessible to folks. So I say, let's just settle in. Let's just relax for a while. You can go ahead and close your eyes. And then in later sessions, and even at the end of that session, I may, as I'm talking about different ways of taking care of ourselves, I'll say, when we talk about healthy exercise, one of the experts that I'm introducing talks about mindful exercise. What's that? What does that mean? It means paying attention to our body as we're exercising. How do we avoid injury? By actually noticing the way our body is moving. This is tied to meditation. So then I bring in that link. And so every session then has a period of meditation at the beginning. Every session then has some period of concept for that day. And then every session refers to either past clinic cases or some of my past experiences, or my colleague, my co-teacher, Suzanne Luban, maybe some of her past experiences. And then the students are invited to reflect on success. So every session is also tied to self-efficacy theory from positive psychology, the theory founded by Dr. Alex Bandura, the late Alex Bandura. The notion that if you want to help someone develop proficiency in an area, help them recognize the ways in which they already have some proficiency there. And so at every session, I invite students to reflect on a way in which they've already been successful. So in that first session, reflect on ways that you already have noticed the times that you are out of sorts, and what you did to bring yourself back to wholeness, because that's a positive story. Reflect on that and then pair up, talk about your positive story. Then we'll come together as a group and talk about insights either from your reflection or, with permission from your partner, from your pairing. And that reflect, pair, group sharing is carried through all the sessions, and it is also a way to both ground folks in a key clinic principle of reflection, as well as to help create a more bonded community of students. And so those are just another really important part of the overall structure. I could talk about each of the sessions, but maybe I should pause.
I love that. I really love kind of that. It's almost like transfer of learning from their life, right? That they already recognize we all have developed strategies to take care of ourselves. We're all still here. And so I really like that, because also when you're just kind of preaching more generally about self-care practices, the students really know, people really know what resonates with them and what really works for them. So I really enjoyed that piece and that tool. So can you just clarify these 6 sessions that you're doing with students, or 6 weeks that you're spending with students, is this completely separate and apart from the other, I imagine, doctrinal and other issues and skills you need to be developing in clinic, or is it happening in tandem at the same time, I assume, given you only have 12, 11, 10 weeks?
It's happening at the same time. And what I strive to do is to, even though these are happening so when they're in our clinic, Stanford's clinics are immersive, so the students have no other coursework. And so they are seeing us all day, every day. And during some of the days of the week, they are in workshops. Some clinics have a certain day that is their seminar day. In my clinic, our workshops sometimes we might have a couple a week, but I want them to recognize that the self-care sessions are separate. So I don't call them workshops, I call them self-care sessions. I invite them not to bring laptops. This quarter, we actually have identified a separate space that we go to for those sessions. So even though they're happening during the same quarter, and it could have been, the same day as another workshop or a day later, they have a very different feel to them. So that's the story there.
That makes sense. So I also really enjoyed you sharing that you've learned so much and built upon everything that's already out there in the other helping professions. And really, it's the law schools that are kind of behind on this and not integrating it as a key part of our curriculum. But I also, and you're building on so many important concepts and thinkers here. One thing that we had talked about a little bit before today that I was hoping you could share is this concept of the power of vulnerability. And if you could talk a little bit about where that comes from, what it is, and kind of how you interpret that, because I know that's something that you bring and talk about quite a bit with your students.
It is. Sorry, hold on just a moment. I'm at a little standing desk and it's moving up and down. But there are a couple of things I wanted to mention about vulnerability. One is that the sessions prior to some of the innovations from this summer already included the power of vulnerability. I have the foundational session. I have a session on being with suffering, a session on breaking bad news, a session on managing boundaries between attorney and client, a session on vulnerability, a session on celebrating resiliency, which is a capstone session. The vulnerability session, until this summer, was a session that focused primarily on the beneficial teachings of Dr. Brene Brown, the Houston researcher who's probably everybody on this call has heard of. And I think her work is amazing. I think the idea and the reason that I need it in in the clinical space, the reason I provide it to our students, is that I tell them the key takeaway here is that if we're not able to be vulnerable, then we limit our authenticity. If we are not able to be vulnerable, then we limit our ability to ask for care. We eliminate or reduce our ability to then receive care from others and to create community. So, Dr. Brene Brown talks about this as the birthplace of love and belonging. And I fundamentally agree with that. But when I place it, it's situated in the clinic context, it's situated in the context of we care about you. And in order for us to be able to help you, we invite you to create some safe way that you can be vulnerable, so that you can receive the care that you need, whether it's from us as your faculty, whether it's from your friends, whether it's from your family. Oftentimes for students and for people out as just adults out in the world, we create this carefully curated image of ourselves, and we operate from there, which prevents us from actually getting the support that we need. So that's really the key takeaway to the self-care session on vulnerability until this summer. The pivot that I made this summer, which I wish I had made even earlier, which is so important, is a pivot based on an anthology by Tarana Burke and Brene Brown. I need the name of the anthology. I will get to it later, though. I know I have it here in my notes. Let's see. You Are Your Best Thing: Vulnerability, Shame, Resilience, and the Black Experience. And what the key takeaways from that work, which I now incorporate into my vulnerability workshop, is that yes, vulnerability is very important, but when we now expand the lens in order to recognize what vulnerability looks like and its expression in communities of color, that's a different conversation. And I'm very explicit by saying that because of the culture of white supremacy in this country, vulnerability can be very dangerous for people of color. It doesn't mean that somehow we develop superhuman strengths that eliminate the need for vulnerability. We need it as much as anyone else. Mm-hmm. But the pathway to safe expression of vulnerability for people of color is through forums and spaces that are intentionally welcoming to people of color. And what Tarana Burke also says, which I bring to this workshop, is that excellence and strength for people of color is exhausting, actually. That labor is not liberation, and that we have to stop and take care of ourselves. And so that pairing of Brene Brown's ideas and Tarana Burke's ideas, and expanding the lens around what vulnerability looks like in the broader community instead of only in the majority culture, is really important, and is a fundamental shift in the way that I teach vulnerability in my clinic.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That makes me think of the NAP ministry, which I'm sure you might have heard of, and the concept that rest is resilience, or rest is resistance,
mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm. Rest is resistance, yeah.
Right. Yeah, it's so important. I think one thing we haven't spoken about is you were doing this work long before COVID-19 came on the scene, but I do wonder if you think that your thinking on it has changed, or maybe other people's thinking on it has changed, and people have become more receptive to these ideas kind of following the pandemic, which I recognize we're still in. But what effect has this had on issues of attorney and law student mental health and well-being?
I think, thank you for that question. And my answer to that is informed both by my work with students and my work in the new summer course with the federal defender, with the federal defender office in this district. I could talk a little bit more about that course in a moment, but the pandemic lessons, first of all, in the student realm, since that's, how I'm getting paid, in the student realm, what we've recognized, at least what some of us have recognized, is that there's really substantial impacts on students from the pandemic. The burden that students have carried. It feels like this year, speaking personally, the students that I'm meeting, it feels like things have lifted, and I'm really pleased about that. But for the last 2 years, it's, I think, been very difficult for students to engage with the material at the same time that they're engaging with in many instances, real loss, potentially grieving the loss of a family member or someone else in their broader community, dealing with the uncertainties around the pandemic, dealing with the requirement to, in some instances, be outed more or less as somebody who is particularly vulnerable to COVID, whereas maybe earlier they wouldn't have had to, and dealing with institutions that unfortunately oftentimes are not as focused on their well-being. And so even in the best of times, that's a problem. But then when you're in a situation where a focus on well-being becomes paramount, it's even harder for students. And so that's something that we certainly have attempted to address in clinic by being transparent about the impact that the pandemic has had on all of us, and by inviting, by trying to create more structures for support for students. I would say that paradoxically, perhaps on the attorney side, what I noticed is that in presenting to attorneys and teaching to attorneys, there have been some benefits from the pandemic. There have been benefits and disadvantages. The benefits are that for some people, it's meant that they had, whether they liked it or not, time. They had more time than they'd had in years, time that they could potentially use to take care of themselves, time that they could use to begin to reflect on where they are in the world, on where they want to be. Sort of a, externally imposed retreat. And so that's a real benefit. On the disadvantage side, whether it's for attorneys or for students, certainly what is clear is that folks have had a real impact on their social well-being. And so I would say there are some folks who actually benefited because they would say that they do better with less social contact, that they feel some pressure to interact and engage in certain ways, and that pressure eased. But for others, the lack of regular contact with their networks was a real negative. So I don't know if that answers your question.
No, I think it does. And it's not a question that you can answer, right? Really, because it's so different for everybody depending on your kind of positionality and where you're situated. So I represent the working parent lobby, and I think that we are still very much burnt out from that very intense period, and it's still ongoing, right? We still have COVID closures, daycare closures, school closures, still dealing with that daily anxiety and the real health and mental health consequences of all of that. So there's no one answer because we're all coming from different places with it. But I think that the pandemic has kind of made it more possible to have some of these conversations, I think, and kind of normalized it just a little bit. I mean, we had, I think, the first National Lawyer Wellbeing Week was in 2020, and that was building on, reports that had happened a couple of years earlier. But it does feel like we're starting to create some momentum with this, and kind of more people are jumping on board this train, right, towards this destination for for being whole and well and healthy together, and thinking about ways to do that. So public defense in particular, I feel like for me with immigration students going into humanitarian immigration, it's the same. The immigration system, in some ways, there's some parallels, right, in terms of the dysfunctional system, the system that's built on a foundation of racism. How do you guide law students going into public defense, right? What are your pearls of wisdom that you share with them? You can't share all of them with us today because they get you for 12 weeks to do that and beyond, I'm sure. But what are some of the kind of key points that you communicate with them?
Let's see. So one thing to say by way of introduction, an answer there is that the students who are in my clinic, some of them will become public defenders, Many of them will go into big law, as they call it. Some of them will go into other areas of public interest. Some will become prosecutors, for example. So there's an array, but there is a core group that will become public defenders, and there are other students at the law school who aren't in my clinic, but will become public defenders as well. And so, yes, it's natural that I spend a fair amount of my time talking with students who are seeking advice about going into public defense. And one of the things that, especially once they've had an opportunity to have some exposure, one of the big questions is, I don't know whether I can do this without burning out. I don't know if I can do this in a way that's effective. I see the caseloads and I worry. And that one of my big answers there is that I think it's so important for people coming into a profession to recognize that they can have impact on that profession. I say to students, one of my key goals is to help to continue to change the culture of indigent defense by recognizing the importance of self-care and the institutional response around self-care. And so that institutional response is around providing support for attorneys, providing adequate resources for attorneys, pushing back against powers that are preventing those adequate resources. And so one of the things I say to them is that it's when you are looking at where you're going to land for that first position, take that into account. Are there offices that seem to be more in tune with that than others? Another thing I say is take a look at folks who are a few years out, because it may well be, take a little bit longer view. It may well be that depending on the jurisdiction and depending on the system, that the first couple years will be, in fact, it's pretty much a guarantee that those are going to be some very challenging years, but that doesn't mean that that's that's the way it will always be. I tell them to think about the different things they're already learning about ways that they can manage those stressors, the things that are external to themselves, but there are other things that are not. And so what are the things they can do to manage the stressors no matter what? So those are some of the things that I tell students.
Yeah, I think that's so powerful. I try and remind students too that culture is made up of people. So one person can actually change a culture, right? You can actually, the way you behave, the boundaries that you set, the things you communicate, all of that keeping in mind, right, that the power of vulnerability, and vulnerability is different for different people, but it can make a difference the way you enter a workplace. But you mentioned thinking about kind of institutional care and institutional responsibility. So my last question for you before we open it up to everybody else who is here is, I'm sure there are many people out there in practice, right, who don't feel like their law school necessarily prepared them. Maybe it prepared them to think like lawyers, but maybe not to deal with the emotional realities of being a lawyer day in and day out. And so what should law schools be doing as institutions to address these issues proactively?
I think that one of the things that law schools should be doing is spending more time understanding the data about student wellness, because I think surprisingly that there was still some controversy around whether or not the law school enterprise bears significant responsibility for the state of student wellness. I still talk to professors who disagree with that. And it's fine to disagree, but again, I think it's all about evidence and data, and gather the data, it's out there. And then based on that data, have institutional responses. And those institutional responses include programming during Wellness Week. This maybe it was last week, or I think it was last week or the week before was Wellness Week, and I gave a workshop to students that day, and I was pleased with the attendance, because this was just an optional event, but there was space made for it, right? And a lot of students came. And for an institution to signal that this isn't something that's unusual, but that this is an integral part of our recognition of what we need to do for you, providing more resources, very specific resources, mental health resources. There are too many institutions where the resources are too few and where the wait is too long, where a student who's facing a chronic issue and isn't going to be able to get a response until they've been suffering for far too long. I think that's so both at the institutional level and at the individual professor level. I think that there can be concrete responses. So what individual professors can do is to acknowledge issues when they come up. I've had so many students who will say there are things that are happening in the outside world that are impacting all of us, and we're not hearing anything about it, or we're hearing about it from too few people. Students who said the Dobbs decision came down, and they were really appreciative. Speaking at first Stanford, they were very appreciative about the official response, and yet also there are students who said, I would like more space in some individual classes for a recognition of the impact that these things are having on our lives. So I think I understand the pressure. I have it myself of there are things I need to get through. But in spite of that, to be able to pause and acknowledge what's going on in the world, some of which has a direct impact on the law. And so you can blend it with whatever's going on in the classroom anyway. And some of it doesn't, but it has a direct impact on people. And I think that makes a big difference to students, because then they don't feel that such a disconnect between their lived experience and what's happening to them in law school.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I think it's the recognition that when you walk in the door of your law school, you don't leave behind being a human being and all the kind of emotional responses and reactions you may have to what you're going through in life. And so I think so much of what you're talking about really it's still counterculture in a way, right? Because if you think about the culture of law school, we still have these kind of glorification of the all-nighters and this martyrdom for our clients and putting clients above all else, right, including ourselves, and just this culture of busyness, right, constantly being busy and scheduled. So really, I think is powerful what you're saying in terms of the individual actions that professors can take and people in any workplace can take, but also the intentional actions that institutions should be taking based on the data, right, that's out there in all of this.
Right. And the last thing I'll do before you open for questions is, again, to put because I kept tiptoeing towards this, is put a plug in for the 8-week course that I gave. The reason the plug is that's an example of an institutional response. The fact that the federal defender for the Northern District of California said this issue matters so much that we're actually going to set aside time over an 8-week. It really was over 16 weeks because it was every other week, and the week in between there were, at least by design, aftercare sessions where people could get together to talk about the content, to engage in some activities like walking together or yoga or something like that, and to say that this matters enough that we're actually incorporating it into our office for this summer. The signaling in doing that is so powerful that those are the sorts of things that I think at an institutional level really can make a difference for, just as there are things that can be done for students at an institutional level, the same is true for practicing attorneys.
Thank you so much for being with us today. I'm so appreciative of you and your time. It's incredibly valuable. And I want to thank everyone for joining us. We did record today's conversation. We're still recording, and we'll make it available on our website along with previous conversations. And we have one more this semester in our series of UDC Law Conversations with Clinicians. It will be 2 weeks from now, if I'm not getting my days mixed up. It's on Friday, November 4th. And we will be welcoming Professor Chris Henning of Georgetown, and she will be in discussion with UDC Law's new criminal law clinic director, Aisha Murphy. And they're going to be talking about something that actually has some connections with what we've been discussing today, thinking about advocacy beyond clinic and doing it all, right? And thinking it through opportunities and whether to engage or not. And Chris Henning just published a book, for example, and is engaged in lots of different modes of advocacy with her students and beyond. So we're going to start actually 15 minutes early on that day. just to let people know if you will be joining us. And I'm just putting the registration link in the chat. I think that's it. And we would love to see you back then if you're able to join us. And just again, join me in a virtual round of applause for Professor Tyler and his time and for lending it to us today. So thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you so much.